professor at the University of California at Berkeley, has appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, where he serves as the chair, the Goldman School of Public Policy, where he directs the Center for Environmental Policy, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. Dan earned his PhD in physics from Harvard, became assistant professor and chair of the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy program at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University before he moved to Berkeley. At Berkeley, he's the founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, and he was director of the Transportation Sustainability Research Center from 2007 to 2015. Since 1999, he served as a contributing or coordinating lead author on various reports of the IPCC, which shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Dr. Kammen was appointed by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in April 2010 as the first Energy Fellow of the Environment and Climate Partnership for the Americas Initiative. During 2010 and 2011, he served as the World Bank Group's first technical specialist for renewable energy and energy efficiency. While he was there, he worked on the Kenya-Ethiopia Green Corridor Transmission Project, Morocco's green transformation, the 10-year energy strategy for the World Bank, and on investing in household energy and gender equity. He began service as the science envoy for the US Secretary of State John Kerry in 2016, but resigned in August 2017 over President Trump's policies. He served the state of California and US federal government in expert and advisory capacities, including time at the US EPA, US Department of Energy, the Agency for International Development, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Kammen has helped found over 10 companies, including 2 that have gone public. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, American Academy for the Advancement of Science, American Physical Society, and he's a permanent fellow of the African Academy of Sciences. Today, he's going to give us a presentation titled "The Green Energy Revolution is Finally Here."
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and I really do appreciate the ability to meet up with colleagues. Michael was one of the first people I met actually when I was a grad student at Harvard, and now I've been trying to send my best students to his lab ever since to take advantage of what's going on. So this is a real pleasure. I will share the screen, and let me just clean it up a little bit and put the slides up. There we go. And what I'll do today is to highlight less of the system science that we do in the lab and a little more of the emerging policy frame, because it really is a remarkable transition we are going through, and in the last few months maybe going through even more rapidly. And so I'll try to highlight just how dramatic I think the opportunities are, both for people in kind of our core area, sort of STEM trained people working on material science, power systems, economics of energy, but really a much broader suite of areas of interest and expertise, and a much more diverse energy and sustainability landscape that I really see coming, hopefully starting as soon as November, but certainly around the world, we're already seeing very strong signs of this kind of rapid pace of change. And so I'll kind of jump into these as we go. Any of the comments I'll highlight here are available on the website of my laboratory, which is the RAEL lab, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And then I do 1 or 2 tweets a day, generally about the projects, and I'll make today's tweet about the A+B conference as well. So I'll try to highlight some of the conversations we have as we move ahead. The work I do is really an effort to sort of build an interesting home for a really interesting and diverse set of students. This is kind of a snapshot of some of my PhD students. Tonio Buonasisi, one of your colleagues at MIT, is one of them, but they range from people working on biofuels to the China power system to health impacts of energy systems in South Africa, China, Ghana. And it's really an exciting place because I would say the core language that we speak is STEM, but much of the interest comes from a really diverse type of scholarship. A little bit hard to characterize at certain times, but hopefully today's talk will kind of highlight why I think the moment we're in now is just so remarkable. And of course, it's important to situate ourselves in the context of COVID, both on the bad and sort of hopefully on the good in terms of emerging, and certainly looking at the remarkable rapid reduction in fossil fuel use that we saw country by country as the COVID-based recessions hit. This China data from early January and from the peak really shows just dramatic 50–60% drops in some of the air quality, the air damage metrics. Similar for the United States, here is NOx levels, just doing 1 year snapshots as the COVID epidemic was ramping up, and you see 50% plus reductions in NOx and smog, and CO2 down 20–30%. And of course, this is exactly the wrong way to run a clean energy campaign. The economic costs of this are kind of incalculable, although we're beginning to calculate just how big they are in the US. New unemployment numbers just ticked slightly below 1 million in the latest reporting. So this is Great Depression level issues. And it highlights both how critical energy is to the system, but also how it's much more changeable than people think. And so a large international project that a number of us have been involved with, both from US, China, Europe. We're kind of trying to highlight those numbers and looking from the lockdowns. I've just highlighted the global scale in the upper left here, the United States to its right, China below it, showing drops anywhere between 5 to 10 to a little more than that % in total energy use and CO2 emissions right away. And of course, this is exactly the wrong way to meet our climate goals, but it does highlight how changeable the systems are. And in fact, coal use globally fell about 10%, remarkable change. Gas use, a little less than half of that. Whereas renewable energy was up during the same period of time. And we're seeing those numbers coming in country after country. So this kind of reporting, we've set up a website and a small NGO to report out these numbers on a monthly basis, is part of understanding both how far the emissions drop can go, but also without good policy, how quickly they could potentially bounce back. And so one of the real features is tracking how much the economy is resetting in the absence of good policies. Thankfully, we are at a point where we have a framework for what we need to do in the long term. And while this graph is known to essentially likely everyone on the call, it highlights how critical a strategy is. And I start with this one really because the pre-Paris climate agreement numbers, the business as usual, 4.5 or more degrees average climate temperature rise with potentially 20 degrees at the poles is essentially ecological and hence economic death as well, although there's still some odd debate about whether the economy is inside the environment or the reverse. It's amazing to a physicist that's the case. But essentially the Paris Agreement, countries committed to cutting out all of the red on this graph, to cutting by about 1 degree C if every country held up their Paris climate agreements at a time when the 2 degrees Celsius path was what we were debating. And so essentially the global commitment was through these national direct commitments to cut off about 1 degree, recognizing that there was more than 1 degree, about 1.5 degrees more cuts we needed to do. And well, I'll mention in a second, it's even more than that. But quite quietly after the Paris Agreement, actually 6 months later, signed in record time when there was seen to be momentum, the Kigali Accords, which I worked on while I was at the State Department, would cut another 0.5 degree, largely through industrial and refrigeration. But it really highlights that one can set a goal, and ironically, there is only one country which is on pace to meet its Paris goals today, and that happens to be Morocco, not Denmark, not Germany, not the Republic of California or South Korea, but Morocco. So again, the Paris goal was 2 degrees. Since then, the IPCC has set a 1.5 degree goal, and that's really what this talk will focus on. What is the window to make that process happen? And I won't detail the backstory, it's too long, but I really do think that the critical agreement highlights how vital it is for international players to find opportunities. And the 2014 agreement between then President Obama and President Xi highlighted a G2, if you will. It was a assessment that the US and China, the largest energy consumers, largest polluters, could set a path that would really change that conversation. And while some of my European friends feel this undervalues the European role, I really do think that when the US committed to cutting their emissions 25% by 2025, the Clean Power Plan, since voided by the current president, and China committed to peaking emissions by 2030, something which China has then upped that to 2025 and has actually made statements in the last few months that as the data comes in, it may be the case that China's emissions potentially peak late 2019 or 2020. And I have a large paper and congressional report coming out in 2 weeks, looking at the potential that might we have peaked carbon emissions now in a bizarre way due to COVID. And again, it really sets up the opportunities to think differently. And while I don't think that the Obama-Biden administration claims direct credit for doing all of these things during that 8-year watch, wind energy prices dropped by 50%, while generation went up by a factor of 4. Solar was even more dramatic, a 40-fold increase in usage and 60% decrease in cost. Energy efficiency continued to march forward in an aggressive way. We didn't have a president saying that low-flow shower heads, that I guess last night's announcement were somehow bad for, I guess, his hair gel. But critically, launching R&D programs that build partnerships both across the United States and around the world. And I think the thing that we will return to most quickly if the administration changes, and that's really highlighting the opportunities for efforts to uplift and be much more inclusive for women, minorities in the energy landscape. And I think that these efforts that get a lot less attention are really places where, as we think not only about the COVID pandemic, but about essentially the pandemic of sort of awareness raising around racism and Black Lives Matter, opens some really remarkable doors to think about energy, not just from the material science, physics, chemistry, where I began my work, but in a much broader set of contexts. And so during the Obama administration, I was able to serve as a science envoy, essentially kind of an ambassador without a specific portfolio. I worked mainly in the Middle East and across Africa on energy partnerships and projects. And it highlighted something that I hope this conference will bring up again and again, and that is the opportunities for both basic research and deployment are so much better facilitated if we're thinking about the global sets of talent and the areas that we don't support people yet, and the opportunities to deploy worldwide. And after all, US energy demand is forecast to grow fairly modestly on the 1% level, whereas in many developing countries, it's 3 or 4%. And so it really speaks to the global need for an R&D scale up to meet these demands. Of course, things didn't all go quite as according to plan for me. Serving the Obama administration was wonderful, but it did come to an end, and I did resign, as was highlighted by Mike's initial comments, over not only withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, but also from just, I would say, racist, as puts it mildly, actions by the president. So I did resign, posted my letter on Twitter, which is how one communicates so with this president, and it did embed a message in there. And while the House agreed with the sentiment, unfortunately the Senate didn't go all the way. So here we are in August, less than 90 days from what I think will be a transformative US election. I did get some boost in posting that letter, and if you go on Twitter, you'll see that it was a couple well-known acquaintances were willing to republish it, and so had a moment to highlight just how much the US was, in my view, off track. And while this is not designed to be a Biden advertisement, I do want to make sure that the degree to which the statements, the campaign platform laid out now by Vice President Biden and Senator Harris really highlight something that would absolutely flip the US from climate pariah to global leader. And so if you look at the pieces that are in the proposed platform, it's really remarkable. This would amount to not just the largest change in sustainability and energy policy since President Carter, but it highlights just a transformative way of thinking. So the Biden platform that only 2 months ago was to get to 100% clean energy by 2045 is now by 2035. And with 40% of the federal spending in this area to be focused on disadvantaged communities. And that's something that in California, we've already codified in a similar way in our rule by having 35% of all state funds as a minimum, a floor, to be spent on disadvantaged communities. And so we're seeing a flip in the perspective to recognize that getting to these clean energy goals is not just about technology, it's about a broader social transformation. And as I'll try to highlight in some comments coming up, the more we look at these opportunities here, the more we really see this as a directly available opportunity. So the Biden platform, to put some numbers to it, is looking at $2 trillion over 10 years of federal money, and up to $5 trillion if you look at that, which would catalyze. And those numbers are large. They are kind of on par with the numbers we talked about for the stimulus overall. But I think it's worth putting in perspective that that amount of money is comparable to what we talked about in some other aspects of the energy, some good and some bad. Globally, we spend about $250 billion a year on green energy investment. That's all the hardware, all the projects. But to put that in context, depending whose metrics, the annual fossil fuel subsidies worldwide are between $1 and $5 trillion. And so certainly a green energy platform without dealing and addressing directly these massive subsidies for fossil fuels is going to have to change in our thinking overall. And again, the efforts to diversify have been highlighted several times. Vice President Biden has highlighted not only a climate justice office would be established in the White House, but also the Department of Justice. And now Vice President candidate with him, Kamala Harris, is the author of a transformative environmental justice bill or mandate. And so it really does change the landscape in thinking about how many of the science and technology efforts we work on would pull together. And again, reintegrating the US in the global in the global conversation, not being a pariah, is critical to sort of thinking through what the opportunities are. And so what do those really amount to? And so I return again to the wonderful graph that I think every energy course highlights somewhere, just highlighting the path-dependent evolution, in this case in solar, highlighting the improvement in efficiency of solar cells with the old standards having a very steady, longer records. And again, the slope of that line is a fascinating measure of innovation. Not the full story, but of course the faster slopes for the quantum dots for perovskites, organic solar cells, highlighting kind of the hope that we can continue to use basic physics, chemistry, material science to really advance the landscape of energy technologies. And as solar has broken price record after price record, you start to hear mumblings about, well, have we tapped out the innovation spectrum? And certainly on the cost basis and the very eclectic and kind of very simplistic learning curve, or Swanson's law or Moore's law, as people refer to in different contexts, just the simple parameterization of cost following a power law with the production volume gets back to a question we were talking about in the Q&A and chat period between the talks. This is remarkably steady. It holds for essentially all technologies that we are able to mass produce. And it highlights, as solar costs start to hit remarkable numbers on the order of 1 cent per kilowatt hour, just how far can this go along? Eventually, we're not going to be able to go to the store, order solar or order batteries, and walk out with more money and more batteries. The price won't go negative, but just how far can we push these kinds of curves? Well, on the material side, not only are we seeing transparent solar, which means we can think very differently about buildings, a wonderful technology with a name I'm not totally enamored with, photovoltaics, But we're seeing now both estuary, river mouth, and marine systems thinking about large-scale solar to take advantage of an open area, but also synergies with fisheries. There's major projects both in the United States and in Europe looking at floating solar as an opportunity to increase recruitment growth rates of small fish. So we can think about marine energy and marine food production in a very different way, potentially freeing up land for nature. So very interesting and evolving landscape. And this is just kind of one technological snapshot of opportunities. And we talked about this a little bit on the break, but the idea that this is unique to solar is far from the case. This is something we did a few years ago, focusing on a whole variety of energy storage technologies. And what's interesting is that here you see a very similar story to the PV one, in that it's not just about lithium-ion batteries. And just the talk before this really highlighted some of the very exciting opportunities to think about continuing these learning curves. And if you look across these technologies, from lithium-ion batteries to the flow batteries that Michael Aziz and others work on who are here, you see again this kind of steady process. And most of these curves have in this 15 to 20% drop in price every time you double the amount of production. And of course, there are two interesting exceptions on here. If we look at the green at pumped hydro, where the cost curves haven't fallen, because pumped hydro is just, after all, potential energy, M times G times H. And lead acid batteries, largely light duty and heavy duty trucks, where the technology does seem to be fairly mature. But again, this highlights that this opportunity to think not just about low cost solar and wind and geothermal other technologies, but literally baseload available clean energy really resets the landscape for where we are. And to put this into context, and again, I'm a physicist, not an economist, but I want to highlight just how dramatically the landscape has changed, in part because while many of us in our technical lives know these numbers cold, I continually meet people at utilities who just aren't prepared for how much of a changing moment we're in. So if I use this wonderful UT Alston website to highlight what is the least cost energy technology across the country, there's a little complication how they did the math on nuclear being the least cost. There's complications on their end-of-life disposal. But at our current carbon price, what you see is a world where green is wind, rust is natural gas, solar is in purple or mauve, and that little bit of blue is nuclear. But that's a world where solar and wind are the least cost over dramatic parts of the country. But of course, in New England and where I live, that's thankfully not the world. While the carbon price, in my view, is too low in the RGGI, the Mid-Atlantic and New England states, here in California and Quebec, it's $20 a ton. And if I dial that in, you see this dramatic expansion, largely of solar at the expense of gas. And this $20 price is instructive, not just because it's the California and Quebec price, but also because it's likely what the opening price in China will be roughly as well. But of course, this is not even the economist assessment of what is the social cost of carbon. So if I dial in that number, it's not in the order of $20 a ton. It's more like 50. And there you see gas is essentially removed from the system as a least cost technology. And as we think about how dramatic the technological change is, but also the need to think more holistically, greening our energy mix without greening our finances is, after all, cheating. That's being complicit in those fossil fuel subsidies. And so if you think about this world, we're not in yet economically, but it really highlights that the policies we're seeing in New York, in California, Washington State, New Mexico, Hawaii, in setting zero carbon state by state targets, many of which I suspect will be brought forward in time if the Biden-Harris team is elected, as really a world where no new natural gas actually makes sense. And that gets more controversial in terms of existing projects. But if we think about that energy landscape we need to be in, it really does change the story dramatically. And while I won't go into the California story in detail here, just highlighting that California's 2010 target was to be 20% powered by renewables. We missed that target, hit it 3 years late, but 7 years later, we not only have met our 33% target for 2020, but we're about 37 or 38% now. Actually, the last 2 months, California has been running at over 70% clean energy, and while the 2030 target was 50% clean energy, solar, wind, biomass, if sustainable, geothermal, and ocean energy. Large hydro and nuclear are not included in California. A complicated one for me as a professor of nuclear engineering. That target is now 60% renewables by 2030 when California passed its 2008 bill to get to 100% renewables. Again, something which I suspect will be updated if the Biden-Harris team is elected. And the areas in which the systems thinking is critical really highlights how material science, basic innovations need to be coupled by a broader perspective. And so one of the features that seemed like science fiction to people in California's housing department when it was first proposed by a state and university team back in 2012 was that we should hit net zero for any new construction of homes by 2020. That is in fact in place today. This is a picture of new home developments that have been built, both single family homes like the yellow one here in the bottom right, and multifamily homes, all of which that need to be built as net zero energy starting January 1st of this year. And if that's not kind of dramatic statement of moving these technologies into practice through, California also passed a requirement that all office buildings of any height have to be net zero energy by 2030. Now, we know how to do this residential one. We do not know how to do cost effectively the 2030 target, but it highlights what is, in my view, one of the best aspects of policymaking. Installing a policy that pushes technology and industry today and is a reach for us for 2030. And so we've got now under 10 years to make good on something which would be critically important for the zero carbon goal, but far from where we are today in terms of deployment. So in my laboratory, one of the areas where we try to pull together both this material science story and the larger grid planning is in looking at large-scale power systems. And so my laboratory, in collaboration with teams in China, in Kenya, in Chile, and in Mexico, build power system models, so-called capacity expansion models, to look at in open source software to share both with governments and utilities that often have their own, but also with people in government, with nonprofit communities, with people who are often opposing various fossil fuel projects, an open source platform to have kind of meaningful debate around power systems issues. And while I'm not going to go into the details of the power systems model, it's a big linear program, we work with a number of governments here. I'm highlighting a number, including Morocco, the only country currently on pace for that Paris Climate Accord, but also a range of companies that are engaged with this, a variety of nonprofits, and then some of the international institutions that work on energy planning to really think through what mixture of currently available technologies and what areas of new innovation in the US through investing in programs like ARPA-E to really double down on better and new storage, on ocean energy, tidal power, a variety of new technologies to really bring the world together. And again, I won't do the maths of the model, but a picture of where this would take us for 2050 is kind of instructive. So this is whatever typical modeling runs. This is for Western North America, so the 20 Western states. The black line through the middle highlights what the forecast demand would be, and you can imagine thinking about demand for 2050 is a pretty uncertain topic, but the colors should be representative. Light blue is wind, yellow is solar, orange is solar thermal, dark blue is hydro, red is geothermal. There's a thin band there of purple, which is nuclear, and then the negative going spikes are the energy that goes into storage. And thinking through the scenarios to get there is part of how California set its mandates for clean energy. It's how New Mexico and others are doing it as well. We kind of highlight lots of different approaches to get there. Some of the hardware that comes out of that kind of thinking is really useful and instructive. Here is a flow battery system installed for Southern California Edison, using a mandate to bring storage into the mix, to essentially add storage into the suite of renewables through via a mandate on storage that we're able to pass in California to bring in multi-hour storage. In this case, you can see powered by solar as part of that mix. That's the good side. On the other side of the story, again, the battle over social justice really highlights the need to think differently. And so learning from our mistakes is one of the things that's going to have to be as large an area of innovation and investment as the clean tech side. And I've highlighted some of the features, but certainly one of the areas where we have not taken the lessons of clean energy and social justice to heart is in our housing policies across the country, where the poorer you are, the further you have to drive on average. We have issues of super commuters. California specializes, but many cities have lowest income workers driving the longest distances to Route 120 in Boston, to Silicon Valley in California, to the Austin corridor in Texas. And so thinking about how our housing policy needs to both be essentially a sustainable, equitable infill policy, but also how getting vehicles off the road are the types of topics that are not just about the science and technology of clean energy. They're really about the agendas for investing our COVID rebuild, our sustainable dollars. In fact, I think on the call today, we have some really neat researchers from the Australian National University that have laid out a kind of a wonderful stimulus package plan there. It's something that we have been working on in the US, and the deployment of clean energy is the place where we have incredible opportunities. And so in a project that we recently completed, we found, sadly, that if you look at where solar is on rooftops, it's not just that it's more frequently on the homes of white Americans than African American or Latino Americans. It's that, sadly, even when you control for income, we did this in a very large project with Google, using their database of 60 million rooftops, doing some machine learning to identify solar, and using census data on income. You find that a majority white neighborhood is 20 or 30% more likely to have solar on a rooftop than an undifferentiated, sort of a mixed neighborhood. And Latino neighborhoods can be 30% less likely, and African-American majority neighborhoods up to 69% less likely to have solar. So that's not just an income story. That's about seeding companies. That's about having equity in the environmental justice movement. That's about having programs at the federal and state level that uplift people to become CEOs, to get into graduate school, to do a variety of things that are critical to really building out a more diverse story. And in California, we were able to push through a divestment program. It took years of debate, but the UC system is now the largest university system in the world to divest from fossil fuels. And again, it gets back to this concept that if we're going to divest fossil from our energy system, not doing so in the financial one is, to put it mildly, hypocritical. It's part of the same overall system. Even on the UC Berkeley campus, I note that 84 no votes to divest. Thankfully, the yes votes carried, but it means this is not going to be an easy story to move forward in this process. And so, again, the areas where innovation really opens some remarkable doors are quite diverse. Just a few years ago, we were worried to death about the so-called duck curve. The idea that this is a demand curve in California, where demand is at a given level in the middle of the night, and except for graduate students and undergraduates, stays pretty flat. And then demand begins to peak in the afternoon and really rise in the evening when both homes are operating and so are businesses. But as we install more and more solar, for example, to meet those goals, the worry was we hollow out this demand curve and we essentially reduce the marginal value of solar in particular as we deploy more and more, to a point where the cost could go negative, which, by the way, the cost does go negative, for example, for nuclear in certain parts of the country. And so the worry is not just the removing of the value of solar, but then the need to deal with this neck, the neck of the duck, where we have to ramp up our production. That's one of the reasons why that model switch I highlighted is so important, because we can think through these questions. But of course, building off what you heard in the previous talk and what I'll describe just in a second, thinking about that curve as an opportunity is really where we're at today. With the falling prices of solar and wind and the falling prices of storage, that over generation, if you will, during the daytime becomes an opportunity to meet that evening peak and to deal effectively with those steep ramp rates. And so one of the opportunities, of course, is to think about storage that would essentially move the green and make it available for the ramp and for the red. And this opens some remarkable doors. While the prices are falling for these technologies, it's really a mixture of technology options and business. And so while California has a goal for 1 million electric vehicles by the end of this year, we might fall slightly short. China has a goal for 5 million EVs by the end of the year. And so in a partnership with a variety of Chinese scholars, both faculty and students who are visiting my laboratory, and we go to their laboratories, except for right now during COVID, one of the projects we did was to begin to look at large-scale fleet changeover. And so this is from the State Grid Electric Vehicle sort of control center in Beijing. But what I'll bring your attention to is this animation that we did for then the mayor of New York, to highlight what would happen if all of the taxis in New York City were to be electric. And so I'll run this simulation. It's from midnight to 3 p.m. Red taxis have a rider in it and blue ones are empty. And so just running that ahead, you see taxis moving around. This is now 1 in the morning, getting to 2 in the morning. Green is where vehicles are charging. And so they're charging in upper parts of the island. And now as rush hour happens, you see a flood of vehicles coming into downtown Manhattan. Now we have rush hour in full swing. And as rush hour begins to end, you'll see the optimal locations for charging after rush hour, highlighting that a charging network of stationary charging in lower Manhattan for daytime charging and for upper Manhattan at night would be a way to really take advantage and to green the fleets. Well, Senator Schumer from New York took this to heart and has proposed a transformative EV package, 63 million electric vehicles in the United States. And if that's something that one might kind of say, well, how could one do that? Let me just highlight one of the first uses of that simulation I showed you. This is a partnership we did with the city of Shenzhen and a small company we launched, actually based in Chengdu, where to manage the movement of the then 22, now 27,000 EV taxis in Shenzhen that ran into a challenge of the logistics of getting them charged. What we were asked to do was to build essentially an AI platform to inform drivers. And while this picture looks like a still, I'll start the video and you'll notice this is those taxis waiting in queues to recharge, because in Shenzhen, you turn the EV taxi to the next driver, and there's 2 shifts a day. You turn it over fully charged. And so the queues could be up to an hour long when the number of taxis ramped up to the 15, 18,000 level. So what we did, of course, was to take instantaneous data on the location of taxis, state of charge, and to build an app that informed drivers where the EV charging stations that didn't have waits were, and to work with the Department of Planning on on-road inductive charging for some of the most highly traveled areas, so that taxis that weren't able to pull in could recharge on the fly. And again, this sort of thinking is going to be critical as we kind of ponder this potential new US goal, 65 million taxis in place. And so again, it highlights where the opportunities are. The other piece of the story, of course, is that we have on order of 1 billion people on the planet without basic access to electricity at all. And so in some of the efforts, we're now seeing distributed solar at the household level. This is a interesting effort, took place in Sabah in Malaysian Borneo, where a mixture of solar and microhydro, now that the price has fallen for batteries, solar, microhydro, and storage is more cost effective than any of the current government schemes to install large-scale diesel generators to power, in this case, longhouses and light industry. This is a special issue of the IEEE we brought out last year on opportunities to make energy access and all of its many benefits, essentially parts of those social costs of carbon, if you will, part of the landscape. So looking at not only village energy, but how can we use this diverse landscape of renewables to save the world's few remaining major rivers from some of the huge efforts to build mega dams, which provide electricity, but do so at very large ecological biodiversity and many areas human cost. And so it's not just about thinking about divesting from fossil fuels, it's about using this clean energy landscape to really reset our opportunities around deployment. And so again, we're working very hard right now in the Mekong on a whole variety of efforts to deploy renewables to essentially save the Irrawaddy and some of the big rivers from very large and very aggressive programs for dams. Same thing is true in urban areas in slums, and we're working with partners at the World Bank, with local governments on essentially a low-cost urban electrification to bring power into some of these very underserved communities. This is, of course, not at all a story just for developing countries. One of the fastest growing areas I see right now are efforts to think about how we can act collectively around green. After all, everyone doesn't own their roof, and those lessons of environmental justice are very much focused on the challenges of not being able to provide power for low-income communities. And so the state of California is sponsoring a number of what are so-called eco-blocks, efforts to build. Here's a 40-home block in Oakland, is a project that we're doing with the state of California, to build rooftop solar, but in this case, to do it communally. Each roof according to their overall area, but the energy doesn't go to each home. It actually gets stored in a battery, and this is in this case in a garage in the neighborhood, and then redistributed not only to power the homes, but also to power publicly available EV charging. And if anyone saw the news from Lyft recently with their roughly 2 million drivers, they've committed to transition the entire Lyft fleet to electric vehicles by 2030. I love the commitment. I think it could be perhaps 5 years more quick than that, but it highlights the opportunities to pay drivers better, to make EV vehicles available to low-income individuals, and to really accelerate the clean energy process on both stationary power and on the electric vehicle side. And that really brings me to the conclusion, that is that as we think about this transition, by having waited and waited to begin this decarbonization pathway, we've taken the difficult but doable blue line, the one that we could have been doing, that's a 3% per year decarbonization. We've blown past that to the rust-colored line where we would need to be doing roughly at 4%. And if we wait longer, we get to a point where we would have to be at this kind of 5% level to get down to these low carbon levels. Well, just to put it in context, California at its best, China at its best, and Northern Europe at its best have achieved the blue, 3% per year, but never for decades, for the order of 5 or 6 years of 3% per year of steady improvement. We have never done the 4%, let alone the 5%. And so thinking about how to put those levels of decarbonization into action is going to take all the large scale efforts I've mentioned, but also attention on our own individual level. So one of the projects that we were involved with for the state of California was to build a series of carbon footprint calculators. This is the website for the research version. There's also a version called cooledclimate.org. You can get on your phone. But one of the real features here was that it highlights the many, many opportunities to invest stimulus dollars in green. And let me just give an example. So this is kilowatt hours a year used across the country. Here's the carbon embedded in food across the country. Here is natural gas usage, goods and services, and you'll notice the cities often appear as kind of reverse pimples, a little green core with a red large suburb. So thinking about transportation, not only of people, but also of the packages we deliver of our goods is a critical part of the process. And again, carbon emission by zip code really gives us a starting point to think about how we can think differently about cities. And so just using New York as an example, while Manhattan itself has people who do have lower individual footprints, it's really that economic story and the massive commuting footprint, the transportation footprints we're going to have to think very differently about. And so again, I highlight that because as much as we think system change is required at the large technological level, also thinking very hard about how we can make these technologies and these choices available for individual citizens is critically part of the story. And these kinds of understanding your own mapping, this is carbon footprint averaged over each zip code, allows any business or homeowner to go in and look at what are the choices they've made relative to how much they decarbonize. And so I'll stop there and give us some time for questions. I appreciate you letting me run through a lot of material quickly, but really to highlight how diverse the landscape of now very cost-effective decarbonizations opportunities are for us. So thanks so much, and I look forward to some of the dialogue, and I'll stop sharing to make it more of a screen interactive. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kammen, for such an inspirational presentation on what our future could look like. Maybe I could lead off with a question about your opinion. If there is an administration change, they may be asking you for advice. What kind of advice would you be giving?
Well, certainly I think that the first piece of kind of advice is that the platform laid out, this 2035 goal, is just a transformational change, and to think about it not only in terms of the energy technology, but about the environmental justice is the critical piece. I actually don't think we can meet this goal without making social justice as critical a lever as the technological one. And so finding the opportunities to address both of those. And so I illustrated the vehicle opportunity, or what Lyft has announced, as examples of places where we can see real opportunities to make the transformation to electric transit. And that by electric, I mean hydrogen as well. That's also included in the Schumer bill adopted by Vice President Biden. But to make environmental justice a core part. And so part of that Lyft plan is a proposal was to make the access to to electric vehicles for even the lowest income drivers by subsidized access to vehicles as an example of that policy. Investing COVID stimulus dollars in low-cost, sustainable green housing without natural gas is another example of that piece. And so I would say the first piece of advice is to mine what states across the country have done. Hawaii's done a remarkable job in terms of large-scale clean energy deployment. We've seen efforts on retrofits. Interesting op-eds have appeared around not only the energy story itself, but thinking about a conservation core that could be built up to reinvest in more sustainable agriculture, to do forestry projects. And so a range of these opportunities is one part of it. The other one is that metrics are critical. And everything I highlighted here, I think partially because I'm a physicist, boiled down to these metrics in terms of the renewable portfolio standards. The low carbon fuel standard that California adopted. And there's a bill being developed now for a fee-bait, one of the most innovative policies in my view, and that's essentially to tax high polluting technologies in any given space and use that money to subsidize the purchase of low carbon technologies. Those are all pieces that are immediate in the story. And the other one, of course, is that over the last 3 years, we've done huge damage in the country domestically, but we've also critically weakened the global clean energy story by the US pulling out. And so re-engaging massively in terms of US overseas partnerships, both business and aid, requiring the low carbon agenda. And so the Senate under Obama had passed a bill saying the US would not finance overseas coal projects. That's something that we need to do. It's something that China needs to do. And through the Belt and Road are the largest financier of coal around the world. And so there's a thick agenda, but they all really boil down, in my view, to having these mandates and metrics and holding every project up. Carbon-based accounting, whether you want to call it carbon price or not, is a metric of sustainability and justice. So I think that all of those are the pieces of what I would kind of recommend as a plan that I think strongly supports what Vice President Biden has highlighted.
Okay, thanks. Let me pick one more question out of the Q&A list here. And this will have to be the last one because of the time constraints. What will be the role of developing countries like Mexico in emissions abatement? They're going to be increasing their energy demand and their consumption, and sustainability isn't their primary objective as they're trying to go from poor to wealthy.
Well, so this is an interesting point. Mexico has a very aggressive clean energy program around solar and wind. In fact, they see the U.S. as a huge market for their efforts. And I mentioned that switch model. We deployed the switch model with partners in Mexico at their Ministry of Energy, CENER. And one of the things that you see is that not only are the environmental damages of fossil fuels high in Mexico, but as we look at the opportunity to think about regionally integrated grids, the business case around clean energy is very strong. And so on the border areas, we see lots of interesting opportunities for partnerships that pan out financially and sort of meet this agenda. And Mexico, under the last administration, set up a really interesting and innovative role in the Paris Climate Agreement. The Mexican position was essentially, we will decarbonize to a certain level, but if the global community lifts their mandate, Mexico will raise theirs as well. And so that would be, literally a case of floating, a rising political landscape floats all boats. And I think the last feature, and this is not so much about Mexico versus the United States, but when you look at polling worldwide, low-income, disadvantaged minorities highlight again and again in surveys a stronger interest in clean energy than kind of the dominant affluent community. And you can chalk that up to what you get asked in interviews, but when the Yale University site that does this polling, there's a similar site in Denmark that did, you see over and over again, the support for a clean energy transition is highest among some of the least least benefited communities. And I think that really speaks to the degree to which, while Mexico's policies in terms of, for example, the national oil company are a mixed bag of subsidies, the clean energy opportunity is very, very large here.
All right, thanks so much, Dan.
Sure.
We are moving on to the next